Hello and welcome to episode 19 of
The Complete Charting Guide.
It is recommended you watch episode 5, Basic Tempo Mapping, before you watch this one. In my humble opinion, the most frustrating thing to deal with in charting is a tough tempo map. I've given up on multiple charts before just because the tempo map was too hard, and I'm sure I'm not the only one. But that ends now. Today, the goal is to go over everything about advanced tempo mapping. Even if you can't figure out your tempo map after this video, hopefully you'll be able to understand why you can't do it and what you can do about it. Before I get into it, being able to identify the first beat of a measure is the most important skill you must have in order to do advanced tempo mapping. It's based mainly on your ability to feel the beat and your intuition, both of which can't really be taught or studied. So if you're struggling with this, all I can say is the more you practice, the better you'll get at it, and good luck. We're starting out with something very easy to understand, and that is pickup measures. This is just when the first measure of the song is shorter than normal. To identify a pickup measure, you have to recognize that the first beat of the second measure belongs right here instead of right here. So you're just going to place down your new time signature where you need it, and oh yeah, we're going to have to talk about how time signatures work in Moonscraper. Like normal, the numerator of the time signature is how many beats are in the measure. 4/4, there are 4 beats in a measure. 3/4, there are 3 beats in a measure. The denominator of the time signature tells what step size each beat counts for. In 4/4, we have 4 1/4 notes. 4/8, we have 4 1/8 notes. 4/16, we have 4 1/16 notes. And notice how if I have the correct step size for the time signature, my cursor is snapping to the same line divisions, just that the divisions are closer together. So what is going on with this error that we got? We have a misaligned time signature. This is because we placed the time signature somewhere that isn't already a thick white line. Here the time signature is 4/4. It's telling the game that the measure should be 4 beats long. This new time signature we placed though marks the beginning of a new measure, and it says the measure should actually be 2 beats long. This creates a contradiction, so our tempo map is broken and so is our chart. It's okay though because Moonscraper will still let us edit the chart even though nothing makes any sense anymore. To fix it, we need both time signatures to say the same thing. First time signature should say 1/4 so that it says there are 1 beats in the measure, which matches with our second time signature, which is marking that there should be 1 beats in the measure before the new one starts. Alright. If you looked at how long the video is, you might have noticed that it's not an hour long. I could sit here and spend 45 minutes explaining every time signature to you and all the nuances and give examples, but yeah, I don't want my video to be an hour long, and I definitely don't want to edit all of that. So instead, I recommend watching this video, which does an excellent job covering the topic, and it gives an in-depth explanation of every time signature and gives examples for every one. There is no way I can give you a better explanation in the same amount of time, so I won't try. So if you don't know your time signatures, let's meet back here in about a half hour after you finish that video. Subdivision stems from the idea that humans like to feel music in groups of 2, 3, or 4. This matters because if you have a measure of 11/8, for example, you cannot hear it as one large group of 11. You gotta break it up. So you might hear it. You could hear. Or you could do. Anyway, the reason we're talking about subdivision in the first place is because when you're talking about these complex time signatures in songs, they don't have any one feel. Like, 3/4 feels like a waltz. So if you hear it and it sounds like a waltz. Okay, it's probably 3/4. Or 5/4. Oh, it's got that kind of feel. Okay, maybe it's 5/4. You got 13/8, that could be anything. You can't not use the feel, but if you know your subdivisions and you're like, I hear in this song, you can say, this might be 13/8. If you're like a normal person and you can't do that, I recommend listening to the drums to figure out the time signature. So let's say it's 11/8. You hear the drums, they repeat every 11 beats, might be 11/8. But maybe they don't repeat and they're all over the place. Maybe there's an accented note every so often. Pick 2 of them. See if you can count how many eighth notes you hear in between those 2 accented notes if they are the first beats of the measure. 1, 2, 3, 4. Oh, there's 11. Maybe let's try to see if 11/8 works. Obviously, check if your time signature works before you just assume that it's right. You know, maybe it's changing throughout. That would suck really bad, but it might be. Or maybe the symbols are consistent. Maybe you hear 5 symbol hits and then the 5th one is cut in half before the next one. So you're like, well, 5.5 times 2 is 11. Maybe it's 11/8. So moral of the story is, if you can master subdivisions and filling them, your tempo mapping life is going to be so much easier. So something to think about. Hey, do you like finding the time signature when it's really hard to find? Me neither. But if your song has inconsistent time signatures, you're gonna have to do it for almost every measure. Isn't that so much fun? So maybe you couldn't tell, but I really hate inconsistent time signatures. Basically, inconsistent time signatures is a very hard exercise of finding beat 1 of the measure. So what you gotta do is find beat 1 of the measure, then make it line up with the previous measure so that you don't send your chart into contradictory paradox land. And then after you did that, you just gotta do it another 200 times for every measure in the song. That's... Sometimes really fast or really slow time signatures can completely ruin your star power. For example, a normal song 4/4 at 170 BPM, it's really fast, but you can still make it work a little bit. But if you have like 3/4 at 170 BPM, that's way too fast and you're gonna have to do something. If the time signatures are too short, like 3/4, and way too fast, then you can double it, so make it 6/4. Even though, yes, it's wrong to do that, the time signature is going by so fast that it really doesn't matter. Just make sure that the important parts, like section changes, are still on the thick white lines. If they're not lining up, then maybe have one measure like 3/4, then the rest of it is 6/4. Obviously this applies to any time signature, not just 3/4. You know, if it's 2/4, then make it 4/4. If the BPM is too slow, like let's say you've got 11/8 at 80 BPM, it's a little bit more complicated because you can't just cut it in half. Because first of all, we can't input 5.5/8, and you don't want to do 11/16 in order to double the speed because you're going to make the lines get too close together and it's ugly. But also, if you add extra thick white lines in the middle, they need to land on accented notes. You can't just put it right in the half. And, you know, the 5.5 mark here, that's not even landing on one of the beats. So what this brings it back to is subdivisions, which if we know the subdivisions, then we can know where we want to split this up. So if it's going 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 4, for example, then maybe you could split it into 7/8 plus 4/8. Yes, technically 4/8 is the same as 2/4, but you're going to want to keep those measure lines looking the same throughout so it isn't jarring, like constantly switching back between compact lines to spaced lines, you know? Or depending on what other subdivision it is, maybe you want to split it up differently. And don't forget to use your handy dandy copy paste tool. So once you have one measure this put in, you can just start copying and pasting it exponentially for as long as you need to. Let me just throw in at the end here that you can do this in reverse. So if you have in the song, you think it's 7/8 plus 6/8, just repeating, alternating over and over, you can go, well, 7 plus 6 is 13. So we could just make it a consistent 13/8 if we wanted to. Alright, we're done with time signatures and we're moving on to tempo now. First thing is increasing or decreasing tempo. This is referring to parts in a song where the tempo is gradually increasing or decreasing, which is kind of awkward to deal with in Moonscraper because we don't have a slider to change our BPM with. We have to put in exact tempos on our markers. Now before I get into how we deal with it, it's really easy to identify. You just go, oh, my tempo map is veering off at this point. It's probably increasing or decreasing tempo. So we don't have a slider to get these gradual increase or decreases exactly. What we can do though is approximate it. So we're going to choose some amount of beats, let's say like every half measure, every quarter measure, just however many beats you think is reasonable, and we're going to put down a BPM marker there and we're going to drag it to match the correct note. So here we can see that the waveform is veering off. It is now slightly before where it should be, so we're just going to place down a BPM marker and drag it to the right spot and just do that until the BPM shift is over, and then you can just continue as normal. Now the reason you're going to choose a consistent amount of beats to do this every measure is that it's going to look a lot cleaner cleaner if you're doing it at equal intervals. So let's say every half measure, it's going to look a lot cleaner if you're doing that than just randomly choosing whichever note to align to. Free time is when there literally is no BPM and there's no time signature. I don't mean that it's like random or it's really crazy. I mean literally it does not exist. There just is notes. The problem here is that Moonscraper will always have a BPM and time signature, so we have to somehow make this line up. I know it sounds bad, but it really isn't. It's really up to the limits of your creativity how you're going to make this all look clean. You can try and make it all look like it's lining up as if it were normal measures, which will take some time, but it does yield good results at the end if you can pull it off. You can use measures of 1/4 but at a really slow BPM to try and get rid of all the lines in the middle of the measures so that it really looks like there is no BPM or time signature, and then all you're focusing on is just getting the ends of the measures at the correct spots on the accents. You can keep all the lines in as if it were normal, but just make sure the ends of the measures line up to really show that like the time signature is there and the notes are just ignoring it. It's really up to you how you want to do it, so have fun with it. If you can't find the right BPM for the song and the audio just never lines up no matter what BPM you try, you might be dealing with an inconsistent tempo. Big emphasis on might. Having the wrong time signature can sometimes make it look like you have an inconsistent tempo in your song, so make sure it's not that first. If you checked that, you're sure everything else is right, but you still can't find the right BPM, then you're probably dealing with inconsistent tempo. How we're going to deal with this is that we're going to do the same thing as we did for increasing or decreasing tempo, but instead of just for one section, it's going to be for the whole song. So choose how many beats you're going to take before you place every BPM marker. Let's say every 4 beats if you're in 4/4, and we're just going to place down 1 BPM marker every measure, and we're going to line it up to where the beginning of each measure is. After we do that, then we should have an approximately correctly tempo mapped song. If at any point the tempo map veers off too much, you can place in more. If the tempo map is really bad, like just fluctuating all over the place, you might be forced to place down a BPM marker and line it up like every 2 beats or even every beat. It'd be really unfortunate, but sometimes it does happen. You want to try and get away with as little BPM markers as you can because that means less work for you. As you drag these BPM markers around, you do not have to worry about what the actual number inside the box is at any point, because really all that matters is that the line that you're dragging that has the BPM marker on it is in the correct spot. Now let's talk about some properties of dragging these BPM markers around. It's only going to stretch or shrink the BPM behind it up to the last BPM marker. So you don't have to worry about messing up the whole rest of your tempo map if you're dragging the BPM markers around. If you need to drag a BPM marker in a part of the song where everything in front of it is already done, you can choose this option, which lets you anchor the BPM marker, and that lets you drag this one around in the middle without having to ruin the rest of your tempo map. So that's very useful if you missed a spot. This can stem from multiple things, such as having no drums in the song or having a very ambient sound without any clear notes. But in cases like this, one trick you can use, you can just find 2 or 3 beats in the song that are identifiable, which for some songs that actually is a challenge. And let's say you think they are a 16th note apart. So you put down the BPM marker on first one, and then go a 16th step in front of that, put down another BPM marker and drag it. You can see what BPM you end up with. Then try plugging that BPM in for the whole song and see if it lines up. If it's wrong, maybe you were wrong and it's not actually a 16th note, maybe it's a 12th note or 24th note, because you don't actually know the step size of these notes until you do the tempo map. Or if you're dealing with a song where the beat really is that unidentifiable, you could just treat it as free time because, there is no beat to follow, so you can just make up the rules as you wish. I'd give more tricks for finding the beat, but if you're really that desperate just to find the BPM, it's probably better just to ask for help at that point in the Clone Hero Discord. In case you didn't know, a medley is a bunch of different songs stitched together to make a kind of highlight reel, which can be based on different criteria, but you're really just going to see solo medleys are the most common. Usually the medley's spliced from somewhere in the middle of the song though, and sometimes they miss beat 1 of the measure that they're trying to hit, or sometimes they don't even hit a beat at all, or the previous measure gets cut off early. Anyway, let's take this one case at a time. If the measure previous to the splice is cut off, like let's say it's supposed to be 4/4, but there's only 7 beats that make it in, first thing you want to do do is place down a time signature to get it somewhat close. Then you can place down 2 BPM markers, one on the next line and one right before it. You can slightly move the beginning of the next measure without making it look like you stretched or squeezed the highway. And once you've got it where you want it, then just put the time signature back to what it needs to be. If it's the first measure of the new section that is not lining up, your first priority should be to find out the correct time signature and tempo using a different measure of this section, because your first one's too messed up to use. After you know what it should be, then you can look at how are we going to fix this first measure. Let's say it's supposed to be 4/4, but you only hear 13/16 notes instead of the usual 16. Then you can switch your measure to 13/16, then back to 4/4 on the second measure. If the splice doesn't start on a beat at all, then you can use the same trick as earlier, and we're going to stretch the highway to make it line up with the second note. Polymeter is really a tempo thing, but it's so rare and so niche that I figured I'd just put it in at the end of the video. Polymeter is when you have 2 time signatures playing at the same time. It seems complicated, but really, usually it's just having 2 patterns that are going in and out of sync. To deal with it, just choose whichever one of the time signatures you want. No need to make it too complicated. Using tabs as a reference is the forbidden technique of tempo mapping. Usually we don't recommend using tabs when you're charting because they're often not exactly correct, and you should just be focusing on the audio and what you hear, not what the notes are supposed to be. But it's pretty common that the time signature and tempo of tabs are correct. So if you have a little sneak peek at them, maybe it can give you some inspiration on what tempo and time signature to try for your chart. If anyone asks, you did not hear this from me. That's everything I wanted to cover for this video, so hopefully you can at least understand every situation you come across in tempo mapping. I was kind of wanting to put homework in for this video to help you see the different situations you can come across with advanced tempo mapping, but I think I have a better idea and you're just going to have to wait to find out what it is. Next episode we'll be going over extended sustains. Until then, happy charting.